speaker afterwards. So if you're interested in joining, please do so. And I don't see our student host, but there will be a whole group of people going back to the building where the, Hannah is our student host, and she will be taking the speaker back. So if you don't know where you're going, you can just follow her after class. I have a couple of announcements. For students, we're a part of an international demography school involved with the Max Planck. It's called the IMPRS PhDS, and fellowships open, applications open for the next cohort, and that went out in email today. I think applications are due late May, so you've got some time to keep a lookout for that and let us know if you have questions. We also have some workshops coming up. On the 15th, we have an agent-based modeling workshop. And then on the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th, Audrey Durelian and I, and also Min Cha, will be hosting data visualization consults to get ready for PAA. These are open to faculty and students. And so keep an eye out in your email to sign up for those. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to our director, Dr. Sarah Kern.
Thanks, Jessica. Let me just say, if you're going to PAA or any conference this year and you want to win a poster award, I definitely encourage you to meet with Audrey and meet with Jessica and meet with Min to get some really excellent feedback. I think we have lots of winners as a result of that kind of feedback. Okay, I'm really delighted to welcome you all to Spring Quarter and our first seminar this quarter by Dr. Dan Goldhaber. Dan is the director, as you can see, the director of the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research, or CALDR, which is at the American Institutes for Research. He's also the director of the Center for Education Data and Research at the University of Washington. They're both focused on using state administrative data to do research that informs decisions about policy and practice. At the University of Washington, we're really thrilled to have affiliates like Dan who are working with the really hard task of using administrative data. We have lots of faculty who do that. It's one of the areas in which we're seeking to grow our capacity as a demographic research center. So Dan's work focuses on productivity and reform at the K-12 level, and a whole array of human capital policies and programs that influence those outcomes. His research has been published in the American Economic Review, Journal of Human Resources, Journal of Policy and Management, Economics of Education Review, Education Finance and Policy, Education Evaluation, and Policy Analysis. So he's an outstanding colleague. His work has been referenced in the Washington Post, the New York Times, USA Today, and National Public Radio. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to have Dan launch our Spring Quarter Seminar Series. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Sarah, for the nice introduction. As at least a few of you know, I used to spend a lot of time in this building, and so it's really nice to be back. The building is actually much nicer than when I spent time in it. Can you all in the back hear me? Okay. See, like usually you have to carry around a mic, and I hate that because it distorts my voice, and I don't sound quite like Sean Connery as much as I know in my heart that I do. I know there's at least one or two people in the room that might recognize that reference. I am an economist by training, and I say that mostly just to say that when I was asking Maddie a little bit about like, well, what's the deal with questions and stuff, she said, oh, well, you know, we'll save 15 minutes at the end. I said, well, can I get questions throughout? She's like, yeah, the economists like to do that. And I thought to myself, yeah, the economists like to do that. They also probably know when they're talking to economists that whether they like it or not, they are going to get questions throughout. The truth is that I like the questions throughout, so it doesn't seem like I'm just sort of droning on and on. So I'm going to be talking about teacher hiring and an experiment that I did with colleague Cyrus Grout, and in conjunction with the Spokane school system out in Eastern Washington. And I should say this was funded by IES, but what I'm telling you is not necessarily reflective of IES's positions on anything. But where was I going with this? I was going to say something about questions. Oh, I know. If you have questions, especially clarification questions, please feel free to ask your questions throughout. And I think I prepared more slides than I probably am going to get through, but I will stop wherever I am at 1:15 to make sure to preserve time, mainly for discussion and thoughts at the end too. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on why I think this is kind of an interesting and important study. The background is that there's like a lot of potential, at least that economists think, about personnel economics. So understanding information about who is hired and policies around onboarding and training. And there have been a number of studies that are mostly in the private sector, small sort of firm studies that suggest that how you do all these things makes a difference. There is really very little information about what I think is one of the most ubiquitous ways in which prospective employers get information from prospective employees, and that's from the people who are writing letters of recommendation. So just out of curiosity, how many of you have asked for or gotten letters of recommendation from people? Yeah, it's like everybody. And I think that it probably varies from sort of field to field about how these letters are used and honestly, whether these letters are actually used. But I'm going to hone in on this issue of letter writers. So I'm going to hone in on the issue of the letter writers and the information that you might get from the letter writers in the context of talking about teachers. And here too, I would argue this is an important topic because there are a lot of studies that now show that teachers have a really important impact on students, both in the short run, so on things like their test score growth, their future absences, whether or not kids get suspended, but also long run implications. So there's a pretty famous study by Raj Chetty and colleagues that connects the value added of teachers. And let me pause. I see some nodding heads, but when I use the term value added, is there anyone that wants clarification about that? Okay, thank you. I'll rely on you, Sarah, to tell me of the audience. Value added is a statistical methodology for looking at the contribution, and I use the word contribution purposely here, of teachers to student test score gains. So students, of course, bring a lot to the table when they show up at school's doorstep, and they are different. And you wouldn't want to say, hey, the teacher of the honors class is terrific because look at how well the honors students are doing, because that probably has a lot to do with the students that are grouped into an honors class and not necessarily the causal contribution that teachers are making towards their progress on a test. So what Raj Chetty and his colleagues did is they said, we're going to look at the value added teachers that were in sixth, seventh grade, I believe. And we're going to connect that to students' long-term outcomes. Do they go to college? Do they graduate from college? Are they employed? Are they employed with a 401k, and how much do they earn? And in this study, they basically conclude that if you took a class with a bottom 5% teacher, so if you sort of stacked all of the teachers up based on their value added, and you said, I'm going to experiment with the idea of replacing a teacher that's in the bottom 5% of the distribution with a teacher that is at the median of the distribution, what would that mean for future student discounted lifetime earnings? And it's something like $220 $20,000 to $250,000 in future lifetime earnings. So the impact of teachers is pretty profound. Teachers are something like 2% of the American workforce, 1% of the GDP. So I would argue that sort of focusing on both the question of using references and this particular group of people that we focus on, that there are some good reasons to do that. So Cyrus and I asked 2 research questions, and I'm going to tell you in a second how these questions came up, because they arose from working closely with the Spokane school system. So they sort of came up organically in a way that I think is kind of interesting. One is, I should look to make sure to get my questions exactly right, but does the provision of low-cost supplemental information about teacher applicants to the school district influence the advancement of these teacher applicants through the teacher hiring pipeline in Spokane? And I'll tell you a little bit more about the hiring pipeline in a second. And then what's the value of this supplemental information? And I want to keep emphasizing here that the supplemental information is information that we are going to get from the people who are writing letters of recommendation for the teacher applicants. So when you apply to the Spokane School District, you're asked to submit at least 1 and hopefully 2 or more letters of recommendation along with your application. And in education, I don't think we know exactly how ubiquitous letters of recommendation are, but every school district that I sort of know and have worked with do ask for letters of recommendation. Education, I sort of divide the world up into questions where we maybe know enough about the answer to a question to make a good decision, and areas where we actually don't know, we don't have enough empirical evidence to make decisions, at least well-informed decisions. I think education, we actually know a fair bit about teachers in service, like, for instance, that they vary quite a bit in terms of their impact on students. That's not reflected in teacher performance reviews generally. In Spokane, it is a little bit more. But it is hard to make changes to in-service practices in schools. And so there are all of these experiments that have happened, and I do mean experiments in some cases, randomized controlled trials, over the last 10 or 20 years around different ways of doing evaluation, different ways of doing compensation. And in most cases, those experiments fail. And I would argue that they often fail because it is hard to get, when you've got adult interests and sort of an entrenched way of doing things, it's hard to get change. So I'm enthusiastic about the idea of changes that occur before people come into the classroom. The other thing I want to say about the changes that occur before people come into the classroom is that it's really important, particularly for disadvantaged students, because of the way teachers are paid and seniority systems, there's a lot of inequity in the distribution of teachers across students, and that's true pretty much everywhere that I have ever seen research. It's true in Seattle, I suspect. And so if you can make the hiring of new teachers better, you are disproportionately going to help the students that need the extra help the most. So I would argue that improving teacher hiring, improving teacher preparation, those are ways to help the educational system in general, but help the most disadvantaged students the most. I'm going to say one more thing, actually, before moving on, about hiring. There's the study that I think comes, just by way of background, the study that I think comes closest to what Cyrus and I are doing with Spokane and is most pertinent, is this study that was done by Jesselyn James and other colleagues looking at teacher applications throughout Boston Public Schools. And they find, not surprisingly, this speaks to the inequities I'm talking about, that if you are a school that is serving more disadvantaged students measured in a variety of ways, that you have thinner applicant pools, right? You have less choice over who to hire. But it turns out that the schools that have a more robust applicant pool, they aren't hiring better teachers. And that is kind of problematic because it suggests that they don't have they're not making as much of the applicant pool and the fact that they have more choices as they could. And so that's the focus on that of our studies. How could you make better choices? Now, all this setup would be kind of irrelevant if it turns out that there aren't choices, right? And you all probably have read over the last, 5 or 6, 7, 8 years about the teacher shortage in the United States. I personally think that the way that the press tends to characterize the teacher shortage glosses over a ton of nuance about the way that the teacher labor market works and the extent to which there are shortages. And there absolutely are areas in the teacher labor market where there's acute pain. It is harder, like I said, for disadvantaged schools to hire high quality teachers. It is harder to find people to teach in math and science and special education relative to elementary ed. It is harder to find people to teach in like some rural parts of states. So it's not as if there aren't pain points in the teacher labor market, but it's also not as if schools are all universally struggling to hire people. So as soon as they get an application, that's the person that's hired. That's not the way the world looks in most school systems. What I've got here is a series of studies that focus on particular school systems where they have information about the applicant pools. And what I just want to point out is that in all of these studies, there are roughly 6 to 8 applicants per open slot. So that doesn't, again, mean that that's true for all schools, but on average, school systems have some degree of choice. Yes?
Do those studies report the yield, like if you offer a job, what's the chance that the person accepts?
Well, I know that the Goldhaber and Grout 2024 study did. I suspect that they all did because I know all these authors and I don't remember off the top of my head what the yield was, but this is also based on data from Spokane, based on earlier years. And in Spokane, which is a little bit of a unique district in Eastern Washington. For those who don't know, it's maybe 30,000 students, so mid-sized district, but it is kind of like the choice place to work in Eastern Washington. So in Spokane, it's something like 96% of those people that are offered a job accept it. Any other questions before I go on? All right.
I have a question. I guess I was surprised at how you. I guess what I want to know is how many stations are regularly opened up anyway?
Nationwide or?
Yeah, I mean, or in Spokane, how many stations are opened up?
It varies a ton depending on the context. So after the Great Recession, for instance, there were very few people that were hired. In the last couple of years, I don't know that it's in the thousands, but probably in Spokane over the course of the last couple of years, it is thousands. And I'm glad you asked that question, Sarah, because it's worth pointing something else out about these figures here. That these are figures that are, you can see the years of the study. This is when the teacher labor market is relatively tight. So this is a period where the overall unemployment rate is relatively low. And starting in 2020, there is a huge amount of federal money, ESSER money, that is going to schools that they are using for hiring. So these ratios 6 to 8 applicants per slot, I would anticipate in the future that we're going to have more applicants per slot. I will just very quick, this is kind of a little sidebar, but I'll just very quickly say This is a quick chart to say, to illustrate one of the things I said about the differences in applicant pools across different kinds of students. So on the horizontal axis, on the left panel, I have percent of free and reduced price lunch served by schools. On the right panel, percent underrepresented minority. And then the blue line is the number of applicants per slot if you are a traditional public school district and people are applying to those districts. And the red line is the same relationship for charter schools. And for some reason, charter schools, I don't think that was a statistically significant difference, but charter schools don't seem to have the same phenomenon that public schools do, where you have fewer applications per opening as the percentage of disadvantaged students in the school grows. But don't confuse the fact that the blue line is below the red line, because there are far more public school districts, traditional public school districts in this country than charter schools. I think charter schools are serving something like 8% of students in the country. So you can see that in general, as you're serving more disadvantaged students, the proportion of applicants drops. Sorry, I should have said the circles are the size of the district or school that we're talking about. Number of students. Yeah. Yep.
So, I guess I'm not sure where charter schools fit in the public schools. Sometimes charter schools are shared as place often in public schools. And how would that fit? The distinction here. So like school system size or school size.
If this is we should talk after too, because this is a very select sample. Mostly we don't actually get data on applications. So we were working with an entity, Nimble, that serves as basically a job board. So when you apply, if you're an organization working with Nimble, you go through the Nimble system, and Nimble, works with the school district to move you through the hiring pipeline. So the answer to your question here is both. I wouldn't necessarily generalize these findings, and again, we can talk about that. And if you are a charter school where like you're part of the bargaining agreement with the traditional public schools, you probably wouldn't count these. You should treat the charters and the traditional school districts as separate here. Yeah. The answer is more complex than that, but that's the short answer. Okay. I'm going to start talking faster because I can tell I'm way behind already. There's some evidence from research from these other selected school districts that suggests that the information that you gain in different ways about applicants, teacher applicants, predicts whether or not people are effective as teachers. It predicts their value added. It predicts their performance evaluations. It predicts whether or not you're likely to stay or leave. So I'll just say that's true, except for the Chi and Leonard study. All the other studies find insignificant or statistically significant positive relationships between the kind of information that you learn about applicants and the future outcomes of teachers. Yes.
So what is the applicant quality measure here?
There are different applicant quality measures. The math and reading are value-added measures, and the performance evaluations are however the district does performance evaluations. Generally speaking, in the districts these districts from these studies, it is observations of teacher classroom practice.
And then the percents mean, what exactly?
5 to 8% of a standard deviation. On whatever the metric is. So if you're talking about performance evaluations, and I'm going to actually do exactly something akin to this, so I'll talk about it in a second, but it's 5 to 8% of a standard deviation on the performance metric. Okay, Let me talk a little bit about Spokane. The way Spokane works is that when you submit an application, it goes to and it's changed a little bit from year to year, but it goes to central HR. Central HR does some screening of those applications. And it's based on things that both the applicant would say about themselves. I have 3 years of teaching experience. I live in Washington State. I have a master's degree. And the letters of recommendation. So these generally two letters of recommendation. The district then passes that information onto schools. At the school level, there is a school hiring committee that is usually the principal or the assistant principal and 2, 3, 4 teachers that look at the application and they rate it. And I don't have time to talk about all of the ratings, but there is a paper, if you're interested, where we used this school assessment of the teachers along 6 different dimensions that get scored and check to see if these scores are correlated with later teacher performance. And the answer was that they are, both teacher performance and attrition. But one of the things that came up when we looked at this, and again, there are 2 things that came up. One, on some of these dimensions that the schools are trying to assess about the teachers, you have good cultural competence, for instance. There's not very good inter-rater reliability. And we can see this because we see that the ratings happen by multiple people of the same person, right? And we can see this both inside schools because of multiple hiring teams and because when you're applying to Spokane, sometimes you're applying to multiple schools in Spokane. So we can see like how much of the inter-rater reliability is, within school, between school, et cetera, et cetera. But the bottom line is, for some dimensions of teacher quality, there's not very good agreement about what you're actually looking for. Now, overall, the summative scores are predictive of future performance. So there's enough agreement that it matters. The scores matter. When Cyrus and I did this earlier work, Cyrus showed me I think he was doing it in SAS. I don't know how many people were, maybe it was state, I don't remember. But he's like, oh, it's X4 dimension that really matters. And I'm like, what's X4? Or he sent me the output. I'm like, what's X4? That's the one that's really statistically significant. And it turned out that that's classroom management. So I'm like, how is it that Spokane is inferring something about classroom management based on basically the written assessments, right? And when we went back to Spokane and talked to them about it, it comes from the letters of recommendation. And the letters of recommendation don't actually say anything super specific about classroom management, but having read a bunch of these letters of recommendation, you can see it in them. So some of them will say nothing about classroom management, and some of them will have lines like, hey, I've seen Miss Jones in front of a really challenging class, and within 5 minutes, all the students are singing to the same tune. So there's those kinds of lines appear in these letters. And actually the district, the HR people from the district would sometimes go out to the schools and do trainings about how to read between the lines in these letters. So the idea was, why don't you ask the letter writers directly what they think about the things that you all want to know about? So that was the genesis of this project. So what ended up happening is when people applied to Spokane, and I'm sure it's on one of my slides, I think it was from like 2018 to 2024. I don't exactly remember the years, but when you applied to Spokane, the people who submitted the letters of recommendation, the candidates had to get their emails Those emails were sent to us at Cedar. We then sent out a quick survey, which you're going to see in a second, to the letter writers, asking them about the applicants. So we asked, based on your professional experience, how do you rate this candidate relative to his or her peer group in terms of the following criteria? This is the form that we came up with in conjunction with Spokane. So we're asking several different dimensions, challenges, students, classroom management, et cetera, et cetera. We ask different things, but these are not necessarily, as you all, I suspect, necessarily truly different dimensions. And in fact, there's a high correlation across in the ratings across these different dimensions. And the other thing that I would just note is at the bottom, we tried to ask this in a way to get spread in the ratings. Because if the answer for all candidates is, hey, they're all terrific, you can't use the information to make any decision. And this issue of, in education, in K-12 at least, of people, being sort of universally competent or excellent and not having spread is a problem. So I want to point out that the top of this rating scale is, this person is among the best that I've encountered in my career, top 1%. This is the distribution of ratings across these different dimensions. And what you can see, I'm trying not to move away from the mic, but what you hopefully can see is that very few people are average or below. And if you were to look at the top, this is amongst the best people I've seen, top 1% in my career. 20% of the rate of people were rated top 1%. Now that is not impossible because Spokane is a choicey place to work, but it's probably unlikely. So I think it's reasonable to say that there's some degree of inflation or cheerleading that is going on. All right, I'm gonna skip over this. All right, so that is the setup for, and it really is, what time is it? It's 1:05. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing here statistically, and say there's sort of two things that you might get from these ratings. On the one hand, maybe the ratings themselves tell you something in addition to the letters that the district is already getting and reading, right? So there's sort of, on the Venn diagram, you're getting different kinds of information. And that extra information could help you to make better hiring decisions. But maybe it doesn't give you any extra information. So that's one of the things that we're going to look at. But even if it doesn't give you any additional information, it still might be a more efficient way to get the information. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. Okay, so the experimental part of this is, we wanted to see both, do these ratings predict future performance, and does the district use the ratings? So for about half of a random subset of about half of the applicants, we appended to their application the information that we gathered from the letter writers. And this is just a picture of what got appended to the applications. I'm going to gloss over some of these econometric details. But what I will say is, I showed you the form, so you know that the ratings are categorical along a number of dimensions. We used a graded response model, which is a common way of taking these categorical measures and turning it into kind of a continuous measure. So I'm going to look at and mostly talk about the ratings in standard deviation terms, using the information that's garnered from this graded response model. And we're gonna let's see, do I want to talk about this? What we're going to do is we're going to estimate regressions for the likelihood that people advance out of central HR to the school level. We're going to look at whether getting the information from the letter writers, these ratings, affects the school level screening score that you receive. And we're going to look at the likelihood that getting these ratings affects being hired ultimately or being offered a job. And again, these are pretty much synonymous in Spokane. I'll just quickly say that we look to see whether the characteristics of the sample where we provided the information about what the letter writer said back to Spokane looked like the sample of applicants where we withheld the information. And the answer is that none of these differences between withheld and provided are statistically significant. So it looked like the experiment worked. There was nothing sort of strange about the way the experiment was conducted. Just to give you a quick picture, I've already sort of talked through this, but in Spokane, there's this you apply centrally. There is a screening process that goes on. You get passed to the school level. If you make the screen, you get scored by these school level hiring teams, and then you're hired or you are not. They're out of about 2,500 applicants over the course of the years that we did this study. 199 of them, or about 7 point something or 8%, were ultimately hired. So when you're looking at the results, think 8% of people are hired. We focus on whether you're hired into your first job for some econometric reasons that I don't have time to talk about, but maybe can if you're interested in Q&A. Okay, here's the econometric model. Again, I'm going to gloss over this, except to say that what we are looking for is, does the rating, if you receive it, influence the likelihood of being hired? And so there's sort of two things that could be going on. It could be that just getting provided a rating influences hiring. And it also, which is not itself indicative of whether or not the ratings are being used well. What we're really interested in is, if you get the rating, does the rating that you receive influence whether or not the likelihood that someone is hired? So I would expect that if you get a rating and it's a low rating, you should be less likely to be hired. And if you get a rating and it's a high rating, you should be significantly more likely to be hired. So econometrically, I'm interested in, can you see my cursor? In the interaction term between the provision of the rating and the GRM score, which again is this continuous measure of the ratings that you can receive. Okay, I've skipped that. All right, this is just yes.
Every variable in there for whether or not they're an internal candidate. Do you have other data at the application, whether they're referral, and whether the person who wrote their reference is blind to the higher manager?
We don't have that exactly, but we do know if the person is internal to Spokane. So we put in a control for whether you're an internal applicant. So if you are moving to a new school in Spokane, you still have to go through this process, and so we have control for that. But we don't know if someone from a neighboring school district, might know people in Spokane. We don't have that level of information.
Referrals.
Well, tell me what you mean by referral.
I think he would be a good fit if you apply for this role. And when I apply for the role, I say somebody in Spokane thought I'd be a good fit to that something.
Yeah, we don't know that. And I don't think there's anything in the Spokane hiring system that indicates whether a person was a referral or not. But I'm not sure about that because it's been a while since I've looked at the system, but I don't think there is. All right. So just, I I just want to point out, I guess, two things, and I'm gonna focus first on the right-hand panel, which is the school level screening score that you get. Everything's measured in standard deviations. And the bottom panel, which is the probability of being the probability of being hired. And in both cases, as the GRM goes up, you are more likely to get a better, whether you are amongst the applicants where the information is provided to the district or not, you're more likely to get a better score from the district and you're more likely to be hired. And that makes sense because, again, remember that the school system and the schools, they have these letters and they are reading them. So people that score the applicants better on this rating that we receive should also probably be writing stronger letters. So these upward sloping lines are what we would have expected. That was not true for advancing to the school level. And frankly, I have some theories, but I don't know exactly why. When the information was withheld, the information from the letter writers was withheld, that you actually have a lower chance as your ratings go up of advancing to the school level. Yes.
Like a random box thing where you actually want to know more about people, so when you remove the presence of that, and you make assumptions and your kind of biases show up in how you.
Well, then I would have expected a line that looked like the red line that was below it, but parallel, right? But in this case, what the line indicates is that as you get rated better by the people who are writing your letters, you're less likely to be hired. And so that seems like more of a puzzle to me. All right, I have to start going even faster. So I apologize if I'm going super fast. These are the regression results, all right? And so we look at advanced to the school level, the school screening score, whether, and a couple different measures of whether you are hired. And again, I'm going to focus in on the area that is that is inside the red box, because that's the interaction term, right? Between your actual rating and whether the rating was provided back to the school. And it's a little strange that it's positive to advancing to the school level, but it's not statistically significant at the school level in terms of the score that you get or whether or not you're hired. So my conclusion is that the district is not using this in at least as a useful way as it could. Yes.
Would this be the same phenomenon where like among NBA players, height is not predictive of being a good NBA player? So like height is super predictive
Of whether you make it. Yeah.
Being graded.
That is a great leading question. You're going to have to survive one slide, I think, if I remember my slide order, and then I'll answer your question. Here's just the same kind of picture where instead of using the graded response model, we looked at the actual categorical dimensions. And what you can see is these things tend to slope up for the school level screening scores, for hiring, and hiring if you advanced to the school level. So getting a better rating increases the likelihood that you are hired, but the school knowing that you got a better rating does not differentially increase the likelihood of being hired.
Okay, another knowing question. They could just be inferring the relevant data from the letter.
They absolutely could. Yes. Yeah, not an annoying question, a good question. Okay, it's a couple slides. I'm going to come back to your question. Okay, you've seen this picture before. We're going to kind of dig into this question. The first thing is, this is where I wanted to go. Sorry, what's your name? Jason? Jason. So Jason is raising the point that, hey, we only see these results for the people that ultimately are getting hired, right? We only see the performance evaluations for those people. So, you might worry about this in terms of the relationships. Now, Jason, it turns out that even only seeing it amongst those that are hired, it is statistically significant. But the issue is that you might think that the people that get hired, despite maybe having a low rating, that there's something else that in person, they knock it out of the park. They're like great communicators. And so if there are things that are unobserved to the statistician, the unobservables, you might expect that those unobservables for the group that are hired are different from the group that are not hired. And I would expect it to be a negative correlation for those that are hired, which would tend to bias the coefficient on the predictive power of these ratings to infer something about these applicants. Sorry, that was a lot. Again, I'm already over. I'm gonna stop myself in 2 minutes. So we look at this question using a Heckman selection model. I can't talk all the way through this except to say that we use 2 instruments. We use the quantity of competitors for each job as one of the instruments for those who are statistically familiar with this. And the other instrument is the quality of the people who are competing for particular jobs. And the results worked exactly as you might expect in this Heckman model. So I put up the relationship between the school level screening scores and the GRM ratings in an OLS model and compare them to the Heckman corrected coefficients. And you can see that the people that don't do particularly well on the school level screening score, that they probably did well on unobserved dimensions, which causes the coefficient to be biased downward. We don't see a similar bias for the ratings because this is only for the withheld sample. So you wouldn't expect to see any bias connected to the ratings from the professional letter writers because in the withheld sample, they have no influence. Yes.
Question and a suggestion. So is the 1187, did you randomize your treatment within that sample? I thought it was out of the whole 2,500.
I'm only showing you the results for the withheld sample because this is the sample where you would not expect the ratings to influence the coefficient on the ratings.
And then I feel like you can get another instrument here or two from the fact that like you randomize this out of the population. So like the competitors at the school have their information randomly revealed to the school.
Yes.
So because you're not using that right now.
You're right.
So you've got like more IDs available.
Yes, you're totally right. And not only that, but I've presented this 2 or 3 times. And this is the first time I've got that comment. This is a great comment. Yeah. Okay. We look at scope for change. Like if these professional letter writer ratings look a lot like the school level ratings already, you're not going to improve much by getting the information from the letter writers. But it turns out that they don't always look the same. The screening score and the reference rating, the percentage time that you get the top candidate is about 40%. We use this weighted measure out of the regression. It's a lot more similar, but you can then infer based on maximizing the expected teacher performance from the regression, what the, by maximizing, I mean using the best information possible, which is a combination of the school screening scores and the letter writers. You can say, this is what we predict in terms of performance of the people that would have been hired if you picked the people who had the best combination of those 2 attributes versus using the rating alone or the school screening score alone. And it looks to me like there is scope for change, about 10% of a standard deviation on the performance evaluation. Okay, I am absolutely going to stop. So to save 7 minutes for questions. Sorry to have gone on for so long. Question? Yeah.
For suggestion or for the rating scores, would it be possible in the future to maybe include anchoring yes for future readings? So this is where to be the fact that you have so many people being that excellent or this. So if you I've seen in some instances where you give them a little vignette where you're like, oh, you describe some person and you're like, oh, how would you rate that? To kind of adjust and see if you could.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Oh, so thank you. Okay, so the question is, and I'm going to say, if we were to do this again, might it be helpful to have anchoring vignettes so that people have a better idea of how to think about their applicant and create more spread in the ratings, which would presumably be useful in terms of using those ratings for making decisions. And I think that's a great idea. And it is connected to some of the other work that I didn't really talk about, which is that the relationship between the ratings that you get and future performance is stronger if you have rater fixed effects in the model, if basically you adjust for the fact that there's people have different standards when they are rating. And one of the possibilities for that puzzling result I showed you is that these ratings are pretty high. There's a lot of cheerleading going on. So when you got a, like, this person's a very good candidate, that actually is not very good based on the distribution of ratings, because a lot of people were like excellent and top 1%. So this idea of vignettes and anchoring and I think is important for putting something like this into practice. And we tried to do that at the beginning, but I don't think we frankly did as good a job as we could have. There was someone else had their hand up over here, I thought. No? Okay, other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
Question, which is whether you consider just when we do our first round of hiring about your faculty, at least in my department, we don't look at letters. We look at CVs and we look at statements, and we don't look at letters. And I was wondering if you had thought about experimenting with like not making letters available and just looking at applicant material.
Well, we couldn't do that because it's Spokane's yeah. But one more kind of interesting anecdote. And it may be the Spokane policy, because I wonder if requiring that you submit 2 letters is a way to screen out from just sort of an onslaught of potential applications, because school systems in some cases, they have to like sort through a lot of applications and have some way of screening. But something that happened during the course of this work with Spokane is at one point, the letters were collected by the applicants. And so they were not confidential. And when we were talking to the human resource director there, this is probably 10 years ago, I said, well, why don't you make them confidential? And they did. They switched it. And anecdotally, they said, oh, we're getting actually much more much clearer letters now. And then it switched back. And it switched back because Spokane changed their vendor who managed the process. And the new vendor said, we can't do this. And I was kind of taken aback by how deferential the school system was to what the vendor said that they could do, because this whole thing that we're doing, this was I don't know how much this whole study cost. Maybe it was $1 million. which maybe, I don't know if that sounds expensive or not, but the actual implementation of this is not very costly at all. You know, like we worked with the vendor to get these letters that we collected from the professional references appended to the application, and then it went out to the schools. So that part of this process, and we basically automated the whole thing. So that is not this is not an expensive intervention.
I have a theory that letters of recommendation have changed recently. Now, with the help of artificial intelligence. What do you make of that statistics?
Well, this, I mean, I agree that that would not surprise me. B, just for clarity, all of the years that we are collecting these data preceded ChatGPT. But I think that it suggests that getting letters is going to be increasingly less useful. And so actually, it kind of suggests to me that doing something like this, where you get people to do a simple rating, which does happen in some fields, it just doesn't happen in teaching, might be a sort of a quick, easy, and more accurate way of getting information about candidates.
Kind of to that end, do you have any ideas on what is the most useful, what do you think might be most useful between referral, recommendation, and reference, all which happen kind of in that order? You refer someone to a position, they ask you for a recommendation, and the employer seeks a reference. Is there?
That's not, you know, that definitely happens in some school systems, but it's not universally the way that works. This would just be Dan's thoughts, which are basically useless. I don't think there's any empirical evidence to draw on to suggest what sort of steps in the process or the order of those steps would make sense. It's a good question. Going once, Bill.
Did you look at, know anything about the characteristics of the references, the rater, I'm sorry, references that the letter writers?
Yes.
So what do you
Yeah.
summarize?
The quick summary is you can get references came from colleagues, principals, cooperating teachers, university supervisors, and then like a catch-all of maybe other kinds of people. And who the letter writer is matters. So it matters more if you get your letter is written by a principal. That there was a lot more predictive validity amongst the principals. It also matters who the applicant is. So this system works a lot better for people who are incumbent teachers than people that are right out of teacher education. And I think both those things kind of line up with what we know about teachers, which is that it's really hard to judge who's a good teacher before they are actually teaching. And there's a certain amount of like, I know it when I see it, that doesn't end up reflected generally in performance evaluations. Wait, no, I'm sorry, Sarah. All right.
Principals would know the system. So I'm just wondering if those referees know the rating system and the letter writing system. So I just wonder what the correlation between that rates, the scores, and the reference person. Whether grade inflation happens with different categories of referees.
It does. So principals are the tougher graders. There's you know, it's grade inflation. It's a little hard to be definitive about what that exactly means. But what I can say is that if you get letters from principals and someone else, colleagues, cooperating teacher, etc. So same candidate gets two or more ratings. One of them is from a principal. The principal ratings on average tend to be lower.
And more predictive.
and more predictive of outcomes. Can we, I don't know if, two things. So I feel like I have to end. I'm meeting with at least some of you after and happy to carry on the conversation. And you should feel free to, I didn't put this up, but you should feel free to, I thought my email address was on here. Okay, you should feel free to reach out with thoughts or questions after. Happy to talk with you. All right, thanks everyone.